And welcome to the second webinar in our three-part series of webinars organised by City Science and Landor LINKS on navigating transport decarbonisation. I'm Elliot Reid and I'm a Principal Transport Consultant at City Science, and I'll be your chair for this morning's session. In case you're not already familiar, the series has been designed to equip transport professionals in tackling some of the real challenges that are being faced up and down the country to meet our transport decarbonisation obligations. And hopefully many of you were able to dial into our first event in July, which was on the urgency of change, where we focused on transport decarbonisation pathways and speculated on the content of the then upcoming DfT Transport Decarbonisation Plan. Our panel of specialists, which included Gillian Annabelle, James Golden Graham and Becca Macy Chase, grappled with key questions, including, most interestingly for me, whether decarbonisation was in tension with living standards. And that webinar is on YouTube for those who couldn't come along. Beyond today's event, our final event in the series on October the 12th will cover local solutions to the climate crisis, including a focus on what climate positive action can be taken by local authorities. The panel is still to be confirmed, but please register for that event via the Landor LINKS website. So our event today covers technology and innovation optimism, where we will focus on the current status of technology-led transport decarbonisation measures and drill down into the role that it will play going forward in the now published DfT Transport Decarbonisation Plan. Our panel will provide their views on the role that technology will play and answer the overarching question, how much can we rely on technology to achieve transport decarbonisation? As we can see on the next slide, our panel is made up of a diverse group of people, all with likely very different views on the role of technology and innovation. So we've got Alistair Barnes, who's the Zero Emission Vehicles and Innovation Lead at Innovate UK. We've got Natalia at Peralta Silverstone, who's Head of Propositions at Octopus Electric Vehicles. Thomas Ableman, the founder of the Freewheeling blog and podcast. Laurence Ash, the CEO and co-founder of City Science. And Laura Peacock, the Innovation Hub Manager at Oxfordshire County Council. So how it's going to work today is I'll set the scene initially with a brief presentation. Before we pass over to each of our panelists, who'll spend around 5 minutes or so introducing themselves and providing their initial stance on the role that technology and innovation will play in achieving transport decarbonisation. We'll then conclude the webinar with a panel discussion. So if you could submit your questions on the right-hand side now and throughout the session, and I can put those to the panel. So if we move on to the next slide, please, and I'll give a bit of an overview of the context, and if you switch to the next slide as well. So if you're not familiar with City Science already, we are an organisation founded in 2015 with a fundamental mission to decarbonise. And as Laurence always says, his overarching question that he wanted to answer was, how do you deliver a zero carbon place? So since then, we've grown and we're now made up of a diverse team of transport, energy and software specialists. The section on the right-hand side of the slide provides a flavour of some of the transport-related decarbonisation projects. If you could go to the next slide, please. That's it. Thank you. The most significant project we have currently going is we are currently leading a consortium undertaking a feasibility study examining whether an overhead catenary system for freight vehicles or an electric road system can be delivered on a major strategic road in southwest England. You can see some of the other projects we're involved with below that as well. The next slide provides a reminder. If you go to the next one, please. This one provides a reminder of the wider decarbonisation context that my colleague Bob presented in our last webinar event. So in summary, the UK has obviously committed to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050, which was legislated in 2019 within the updated Climate Change Act 2008. And this was obviously a key outcome of the 2015 Paris Agreement to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. This year, we've seen significant policy progress to fulfil this target, particularly given the importance of the upcoming COP26 event in Glasgow. So as well as the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, we've seen a series of wider policies that have been published recently, including the hydrogen strategy, as well as the upcoming net zero strategy, which will be produced by the Department of Energy Business and Industrial Strategy. Next slide, please. So as this one shows, transport is still the most significant area that we need to focus our decarbonisation efforts. And we've seen little to no change in the overall emissions since 1990. Cars, LGVs and HGVs are the main challenge, and they comprise around 80% of all of the UK's territorial emissions. Note that even if we included international aviation and shipping, cars would still continue to dominate. As the next slide shows, if we go to the next one, please. Yeah. From a technology perspective, we have made varying degrees of progress over the past few years in developing solutions primarily to eliminate tailpipe emissions from surface transport. Arguably, the most widespread and established technology is actually in rail, where we've already got around 40% of the network electrified, and that obviously replaces what would have been diesel rolling stock. I think by contrast, decarbonisation technology for HGVs is only at the very early stages of feasibility. So as I mentioned at the start, there is £20 million worth of studies that have been commissioned by Innovate UK and the DfT to examine possible technologies for HGVs across battery electric, hydrogen fuel cells and route electrification, and that obviously does include the overhead catenary system. And the outcome of those studies should be known by the early part of next year. From a car perspective, obviously we've seen tremendous progress, certainly in the battery electric space over the past few years, which clearly the manufacturing industry has accelerated. Although it is important to stress here that we still remain at the early adoption stages in this space. The next slide drills down into a bit more detail. Sorry, if we go back a slide. Thank you. The next slide drills down into a bit more detail on the battery electric car context to explain this a bit further. So as the graph on the right shows, 2020 was a bit of a watershed moment really for the sale of new cars, given that around 8.4% of new car sales were ultra low emissions. So that means that they were either battery electric, hybrid electric or plug-in hybrids, and that outpaced diesel cars, the sale of diesel cars, for the first time ever. You can see that narrowing of the gap there on the 2020 side. But having said that, it is important to take a step back to understand the pace of change for tailpipe decarbonisation that is still required when it comes to cars. The graph on the left shows that overwhelmingly 98% or so of cars registered on the road as of today are either petrol or diesel. And what this graph also doesn't show is that we've actually been seeing a small increase in the number of petrol and diesel vehicles registered for the first time that are in the higher bracket of carbon emissions, particularly explained by the uptick in the sale of SUVs. I think they now account for around 4 in every 10 of new cars sold. I came across a stat the other day, and I think if you were to get all the world's SUV owners together, they would represent the 7th biggest emitting country. So as the next slide shows, we can look to history to understand how we might see the adoption of battery electric vehicles change into the future. So research shows that adoption of new technologies, whether it's the colour TV or the internet or mobile phones, generally follows a bell-shaped curve of adoption. And that's made up of initial innovators, which is around kind of 2.5% of people, and they are generally those with the highest disposable income and the lowest aversion to risk. That's generally followed by other groups, so those badged the early adopters, which make up around 14% of people, and those are the early adopters are those with a high degree of thought leadership and typically younger in age with a higher social status. These two initial groups are followed by the early and late majority, followed by the laggards who have the biggest aversion to change. I think when you apply the adoption curve to the adoption of battery electric vehicles, we're only still realistically at the initial innovator stage of this bell curve. As we emerge from COVID, it'll be important that this trend continues, particularly when the sale of new cars overall is likely to rebound. If you go on to the next slide, please. And forward again, thank you. So as I mentioned at the start, obviously the DfT has published its Transport Decarbonisation Plan, which, as I'm sure you're very familiar with, sets out more detail on how we will achieve net zero within the transport space by 2050. What you might have missed, and I was certainly guilty of this when it came out, was that alongside the decarbonisation plan, the DfT also published the Zero Emissions Cars and Vans Delivery Plan. And that provides tangible detail on how the 2030 and the 2035 ban on the sales of new petrol and diesel vehicles will be achieved. But I think it's fair to say that despite the quote from Grant Shapps at the bottom there, that we can't fully rely on technology, the Transport Decarbonisation Plan does place a significant emphasis on the role that it will play. Having gone through and done a bit of a tally of words, I think the word technology is mentioned 98 times, innovation is mentioned 69 times, and mode shift or modal shift is only mentioned around 28 times. Technology and innovation also feature heavily in 4 of the 6 strategic priorities there on the left-hand side. So if we go on to the next slide, we can understand what the Transport Decarbonisation Plan actually says about new technology adoption across the various modes. The first thing to draw your attention to is the various commitments on the ban on the sale of non-zero emission vehicles. So going into the plan, obviously we knew about the ban on the sale of petrol and diesel cars and LGVs in 2030 and 2035, but the plan also identifies a whole range of wider bans. So it includes that ban on the sale of non-zero emission powered two-wheelers by 2035, a ban on the sale of non-zero emission HGVs up to 26 tonnes by 2035, and then all HGVs by 2040, and that's still subject to consultation. And it also identifies that diesel trains will no longer operate on the UK rail network by 2040. So clearly these various bands have the potential to significantly accelerate uptake, referring back to the adoption curve again. And the DfT has committed some funding to a range of projects and policy levers to achieve this. So this includes measures like the UK's first zero-emission bus town, Network Rail's upcoming traction strategy, which will identify further proposals for rail electrification, an ongoing consultation, as I said, which is focused on raising the 44-tonne weight limit for HGVs to accommodate battery and fuel cell technology. And also, more recently, we've had a commitment that there'll be new battery recycling laws implemented to deal with the batteries from electric vehicles that will cause us some issues going forward. So beyond those specific vehicle technologies, there's also wider commitments. So that includes things like funding for traffic signal maintenance, mobility as a service code of practice, and stop-start technology in the rail sector. So if we go a couple of slides forward, please. So now that I've set that overall context, I'm now going to pass over to our panelists, who will introduce their views on the role that technology plays in achieving transport decarbonisation. Each of our panelists will have around 5 minutes to set out their stall with a focus of some of the key questions listed on the slide there. How rapidly can we realistically adopt new vehicle decarbonisation technologies, and are the bands achievable? What further government policy support would you like to see to achieve the necessary technology uptake? And how much can we realistically rely on technology and innovation to achieve transport decarbonisation? So I'm now going to pass over to Alistair Barnes, who, as I said at the outset, is the Zero Emission Vehicle Innovation Lead at Innovate UK. And Innovate UK have recently produced their UK Transport Vision 2050. So Alistair is going to give a bit of a background in relation to that as well. So if you could come on the screen, Alistair, and introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Good morning. Thank you, Elliot. Thank you for that introduction. It's great to see those thoughts. I particularly like your slide on the different options or different sort of outcomes from the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. And I'm pleased to be part of this discussion today. So we've gone to my first slide. I'll just introduce Innovate UK for those who are less aware and talk a little bit about my background and my sort of stake in all of this. So Innovate UK is the UK's innovation agency, and we're sort of traditionally at the heart of delivering R&D expenditure to business. So there are other councils that are part of UK research and innovation. Some of those are focused more on academia and funding of universities, but Innovate UK is very much business focused. And Innovate focuses on the new ideas, new technologies that help to expand the economy, drive business growth. And we also have a big role in connecting businesses and ensuring that the right people are talking to the right businesses to kind of help them progress. And my personal interest in all of this, I'm a technical person, I'm an engineer. I have a background in aerospace and in batteries. And my personal view is that I don't want to put too much faith in the developing of technology to help us reach net zero and to help with transport decarbonisation, as I fear that this could result in a delay. My personal feeling is that there is a huge amount that we could do today with the technology that we already have. And I like to try and focus on getting that technology out into the hands of businesses and consumers as quickly as possible. So it's not that I don't believe in R&D, and it is essential to do that, I just don't want us to be sandbagging and waiting for the promise of a new technology that will unlock decarbonisation, because I feel that we can do a lot of this right now today with what we already have. So with this in mind, I've got two things that I wanted to talk about that Innovate UK is doing in this area. So my next slide, please, is on the UK Transport Vision, which was mentioned a moment ago by Elliot. So this is it's a really interesting publication. I think it's in the handouts for this session, so do take a look. It talks about where we think transport will be in 2050, and then it talks about the steps along the way. So it gives us predictions against each decade. Now, if you're thinking about technology and optimism, it gives you quite a fairly balanced view about where we think technology will go and what areas will succeed and what areas won't succeed. So just as an example, it does not see any hydrogen fuel cells in passenger cars. It sees those as going completely to battery electric, and it sort of sets out the uptake of that. So it has 6 areas of focus. Those are travel and transport demand, connectivity, energy vectors, autonomy, business models, and infrastructure. It's been extensively researched. I think it's got about 250 references in it, and it's not just Innovate UK thinking. It's been reviewed by a range of experts from industry and from government, but also we're going to keep it updated. So we are keen to collect thoughts on it, and if people think we are wrong and they have a good reason for it, we will take that into account. So as I say, it's a really useful document to look at for businesses, and I would encourage people to do that. And I think it fits well with this sort of theme that we're talking about today. And then lastly on this topic, we're also going to follow up soon with a piece on sort of it's like a review of where we are with different technologies against other leaders across the world. So it shows how much R&D spending and how many large companies and small companies. So it's a useful piece on supply chain benchmarking that will come out soon. And then next slide, please. So the other area I wanted to mention is the zero emission road freight trials, which is delivered in partnership with the Department for Transport, and was one of the commitments in the 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution that was the policy paper that was published last November. As Elliot mentioned, City Science are involved in this, and we have about 6 projects which are preparing for on-road demonstrations of hydrogen trucks and electric road systems. So those are looking at those 2 options as a viable way to decarbonising heavy good vehicles. And then we also have 2 projects looking at the uptake of battery electric trucks and what can be done to encourage that. So they'll be putting fully zero emission trucks into the market and seeing how well they perform, looking at the total cost of ownership, looking at the infrastructure costs, and that should, as I said, that should help to fulfill my ambitions of getting that technology out into the real world now and encouraging its uptake. And all of this is feeding towards our ambitions to have on-road trials of various technologies. So we're going to hopefully have on-road trials of hydrogen trucks, electric road systems, and also of battery electric trucks in the future. And we are, as I said, at the moment that is an ambition, and we are hoping for the funding to allow that to happen. So that is very much freight focused, but that gives me plenty of optimism about the future, because we have 3 really serious technologies that I think could work very soon. And now it's a case, I think, of figuring out which one will need to go forwards. So I'll hand back over, but hopefully that gives a bit of an insight into my my view on all of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Alistair. I'm now going to pass over to Natalia. Natalia, Peralta Silverstone. She's the head of propositions at Octopus electric vehicles. So over to you, Natalia.
Thanks, Elliot, and thank you for having me here today. I really enjoyed that review from Innovate UK. Actually, we work with Innovate UK as a private sector business in a vehicle to grid trial, which is a really good example of how we can research technologies now that will enable the uptake in the future. So, you know, electric cars have an amazing potential to essentially provide battery storage for renewable energy. Anyway, I am Natalia. I'm head of propositions at Octopus Electric Vehicles. We are the EV leasing arm out of the Octopus Energy Group. I'm going to spend a short minute talking about who we are and my background, and then I'll give you, I guess, some of our perspectives as an energy retailer and an EV leasing company, and our views on decarbonisation. So I've actually been in the EV industry for 6.5 years. Previous to Octopus, I was with Podpoint, who were one of the first and now one of the largest charge point manufacturers and infrastructure operators in the UK. I was with them for about 4 years, did a mix of commercial and external affairs roles, actually did a lot of work with local authorities in figuring out plans and infrastructure uptake for their regions. And now at Octopus, I look after our consumer propositions, so essentially what we sell to our customers. So kind of our EV financing packages, along with any bundle around it. So that could be kind of energy, charging, etc. And I guess our mission within kind of the Octopus Energy Group is to make that transition to electric cars happen faster and swifter, and give consumers the confidence to make that switch, because the technology is ready now for a lot of people. It's about dispelling this and making it super easy and accessible. If I take it up one notch into the Octopus Energy Group, you've hopefully heard of us. We've been around since 2016. We were born out of wanting to accelerate decarbonisation across all sectors, as well as globally. And ultimately, we wanted to do that by putting customers at the heart of what we were doing, by getting customers to understand how they consumed energy, what they were buying, what it was costing them, and offering a really great service around that. So offering fair and transparent pricing with renewable energy at its core. And as a result, we've got 2.5 million domestic energy customers now in the UK alone. We're in 7 countries, and we've got a lot of projects that are targeting decarbonisation in different areas. So heat is one of the big areas we're now tackling with a new R&D centre to essentially ensure that that the technology developed in that space is more affordable. Specifically in transport, we're tackling 2 areas. So we actually have Octopus Hydrogen within the group, who are essentially co-locating the production of hydrogen with renewables, and then transporting that to sectors that need it. So, for example, the first hydrogen plane that flew recently, a couple of weeks ago, that was powered by Octopus Hydrogen. And then on the other side, we're looking at Octopus electric vehicles, which is how do we get more people into electric cars and vans? Technology that is viable today. You know, we've got over 30 models across a range of price points and different sizes and different people's needs, and a lot of the problems that people perceive with electric cars are no longer real. You know, cars do go fast enough, you can charge them conveniently, but people don't really know that. So that's where we step in. So 60% of transport emissions in the UK come from cars. Specifically, my business, that's what we're trying to tackle. You know, ultimately, we've taken big steps in the UK to decarbonise our energy grids, but actually, we've not done a lot of transport. You know, there was a graph earlier on which showed we barely did anything. That our emissions haven't really significantly changed since the 1990s, and actually, that's no longer okay when we have really viable technologies that can change that. And so, actually, it was Alistair's point. You know, I kind of want to see technology that exists today being used today to accelerate that shift. The government has played a pivotal role. They've really supported, specifically talking about electric vehicles now, they've really supported the uptake of those cars and the development of that technology in the UK through many grants across different areas of kind of the electric vehicle sector. And they still support it, right, through amazing things like the benefit in kind company car tax, right, which is in place till 2025. However, we're finding at the moment that kind of the targets that we're setting, so those bands that we've set, right, the 2030 ban, 2035, 2040, etc., they're lovely, And from a consumer mindset, it's kind of putting that in people's minds as like, oh God, I'm not going to be able to kind of buy a petrol diesel car in like 8.5 years time. Like that kind of is starting to ingrain there, right? So it's helping with that consumer shift. But actually from an industry perspective, there's still a lot of not confusion, but essentially people aren't quite taking it seriously enough. So it's a ban, but how much of a ban is that, right? How much is it going to force industry, the automotive manufacturers, people who produce these vehicles to change? You know, we still have conversations with senior automotive executives in the UK who aren't convinced by electric, right? And who kind of see plug-in hybrids as a solution way into the 2030s. And actually that shouldn't really be the case anymore, right? Plug-in hybrids are an interim solution. Personally, by 2030, I don't think they should be sold anymore. Yet we're going to allow them to be sold in 2035. We're consulting on that now. So we are setting some ambitious targets, but we don't feel like there's tangible steps that are giving industry that certainty to invest now in their technologies, whether it's kind of switching all of their factories over to electric for their passenger vehicles, you know, over the next 5 years, or whether it's into kind of heavier goods or lightweight vehicles or other sectors in the transport sector to decarbonize. They're not quite sure what to back yet. And yes, like there are trials that are going to happen now through projects like Innovate UK that will help kind of form a bit of that idea, but you know, government needs to give a clearer picture. What would I like to see in terms of kind of accelerating that uptake? I think from a new vehicle perspective, we're seeing that uptake happen in the right way. People are switching to electric. The incentives are helping. The price is coming down. There is a lot more choice. That is happening. You know, that's naturally going to keep happening. And I don't think I see major barriers in terms of the kind of the passenger vehicle market uptake. However, what are we doing about our existing fleet? You know, there was a chart earlier which showed the amount of petrol and diesel cars on the road. You know, we're talking tens of millions of cars. How are we going to switch over that fleet fast enough? So we probably need to look at something in that space. We probably need to look at something that makes it equitable for everyone to switch to zero emission, because we don't want to make this a technology for those who can afford it and not for those who can't. So probably something like a scrappage scheme, but I think that's an important part of the solution if we want to get kind of those dirty cars off our roads faster. And on that note, I will flip back to the panel, and I look forward to the Q&A later.
Thanks very much, Natalia. I think that was a good note to finish on, wasn't it? So I'll now pass over to the next person I want to introduce, and that is Thomas Ableman. Thomas, if you could introduce yourself and spend about 5 minutes setting out your stall. And Natalia, if you could switch off your camera, that would be great as well. Thank you.
Hi there. I feel a bit guilty, really, because the amount of effort that's going to be required to implement the technology of decarbonisation is absolutely awe-inspiring. You know, when we saw that graph that City Science showed us earlier, that it's taken 50 years to get to 50% of people having a dishwasher, and we imagine what's got to be achieved in terms of decarbonisation of the transport infrastructure, it is absolutely awe-inspiring what's got to be done. But my pitch is nevertheless that even though, of course, we must electrify the powertrains of all modes of transport, that simply isn't enough. And there are 3 key areas I want to talk about today. One is the usage of cars, one is the ownership of cars, and one is the cars themselves. So the first thing is around the usage of cars. If you look at the government's decarbonisation plan, it says, and I quote, "It's not about stopping people doing things, it's about doing the same things differently. We'll still drive on improved roads, but increasingly in zero emission cars." And unfortunately, the evidence just doesn't point to that being a way in which we can decarbonise transport. The government currently forecasts road use will increase by 50% in the time period that we're discussing here. They're planning on investing £27 billion in the road network, some of which is renewals, but some of which is new road infrastructure. All previous evidence is that if you increase the amount of road capacity, you will encourage more journeys. So probably that forecast increase of 50% is a perfectly reasonable estimate. I was in a car industry conference a few months ago, and they were discussing what the actual reduction in full lifetime carbon footprint of an electric vehicle is likely to be, and there were different estimates, but the consensus in the room was that it's actually going to be about 50%. So if you're increasing the number of journeys by 50% and reducing carbon footprint by about 50%, you're patently not in a position where you have decarbonised transport at the end of that process. And it's worth noting, the decarbonisation plan is explicit. In the last 30 years, we've seen massive increases in energy efficiency of car engines, but that has been balanced by more journeys. So we have effectively recycled the energy efficiency savings by travelling more. And at the moment, there's a real risk that we're going to do exactly the same thing again. The second issue is around ownership. Once tailpipe emissions have been eliminated, then the biggest carbon impact will be the production of cars and the disposal of cars. Estimates vary, but every estimate suggests that cars are unused around 90% of the time. And where I live in suburban London, there are some people who live in London but work out in Essex, not far from here, and so have to drive every weekday. And then at the weekend, they get the tube into town for their leisure. And there are other people I know who get the tube into town, or used to when we went to offices still, get the tube into town for their job, but drive out into the countryside at the weekend. Clearly, those two families only need one car, but our ownership model at the moment means that 2 cars are produced and 2 cars are disposed of. So ownership is a key part of decarbonisation. And also, talking about the previous point around usage, ownership is also a key part of the journeys solution as well, because at the moment, the way the transport system works, all the costs, or not all, but a very large portion of the costs of ownership of a car are paid up front. You buy the thing, you insure the thing, every so often you MOT the thing, and then there's a real incentive to use it as much as possible, whereas public transport costs are entirely pay as you go. And so there's a real incentive to reduce public transport cost usage and increase car usage once you've made the investment in buying a car. If the ownership model around cars changes, then it solves both of those problems. There's one other thing about ownership as well, which is that Britain has a global leadership role at the moment through COP26. Now, Britain currently has roughly 1 car for every 2 people, and its population is forecast to remain roughly stable. Bangladesh currently has 1 car for every 25 people, and its population is growing rapidly. So if we can't demonstrate that it is possible to have a successful economy with a reducing proportion of cars per population, then how on earth can we look at countries like Bangladesh that want to grow and develop and provide better services and a stronger economy to their population? How on earth can we look at them in the eye and say you shouldn't try and match our rate of car use? But if they do match our rate of car use, then decarbonisation of transport globally becomes, putting it mildly, much more challenging. And then the third point is around the vehicles themselves, and we heard this mentioned briefly. In 2019, 1/4 of vehicles were SUVs. It's now about 40% of vehicles are SUVs. It's growing rapidly, and again, it comes back to this point that we have a tendency to increase the energy efficiency of vehicles, but then to recycle that, and that's what we've been doing for the last 30 years, to recycle that energy efficiency. So we now have cars that are much more energy efficient, but they're much bigger and we use them more. And this program of decarbonisation is going to result, if we're not careful, in the biggest improvement in energy efficiency we've ever seen. That's what the changes to the powertrain does. But we will then recycle that in even bigger cars that we use even more. So I'm not going to go into the detail of policy solutions now because we haven't got time, but hopefully we'll get into some of that during the chat. But we need more places with great public transport. We need to address the price incentives. We need to address rail prices, bus fares, car taxes, road pricing, enable mobility credits so we can start to redress the balance in usage and ownership, and ensure that the planning system doesn't continue to incentivize people to buy a car through literally structurally building houses that you have to use a car to get in and out of, which we're still doing at the moment. But we can't just rely on technology. We also need to rely on the use of cars, the ownership of cars, and the cars themselves in order to address decarbonisation. That's my pitch.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Thomas. And yeah, no doubt we'll come on to some of the policy discussions in the audience question and answer later on. So thank you very much for that. I'm now going to pass over to Laurence Oakes. He's the CEO of City Science. He's on the phone today, so you might not see him, but you'll certainly hear him. Over to you, Laurence.
Thanks, Elliot. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Laurence Oakes, CEO of City Science. I thought I'd start with a bit of background to give you a sense as to where my perspective comes from. So I started my career in investment banking, where I actually traded the technology sector in Europe. Then when I left banking, I worked for a family office investing in assets and private companies, all focused around renewable technology. And then in 2015, I founded City Science with a focus on helping people and places decarbonise. And so I've experienced technology from lots of perspectives, as an investor, as a founder, and now as someone trying to innovate to pull through the solutions we need to decarbonise. So over the next couple of minutes, I'm going to try and combine everything I've learned about technology and everything I know about decarbonisation to answer that question. What should the role of technology be in our decarbonisation pathways? And if you're looking at the slides, hopefully you'll move on to the next one. First, I'm going to talk about technology, why technology optimism is important, the role that hype has to play in the investment cycle, and hopefully touch on some of the other implications of that hype machine. Then I'm going to talk about decarbonisation pathways and how we decide what a good pathway would look like. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up by talking about some of the timing issues and risks if we want to have a decarbonisation plan that we can rely on. But the first question is really this: how does new technology get off the ground? So if we move to the next slide, the reality is that at the outset, any kind of technology development, all there is just an idea, nothing more than air. How does that idea become a real thing? It has to start with people. So in order to become motivated to do something about this idea, someone has to become convinced that this is the best idea in the world. For a founder to risk their job or their savings or their home to start a business, they've got to be more than just convinced. They've got to believe wholeheartedly to the very core of their being that this new idea, this new thing is a game changer. Once they've made that decision, the first thing that they need to do is convince other people, early customers or investors. And that means telling everyone that this new idea is the best thing ever. And in order to get them to invest or buy, it's absolutely necessary that they tell them in the most compelling and convincing way possible. So the whole process is really a huge sales effort just to even begin to get off the ground. But then to really succeed, the idea is going to need more customers, more money and more investors. And so everyone already invested in the chain also gets to work spreading the news about this idea. And this is where hype starts. Everyone is invested in growing the customer base as quickly as possible. Owners and early investors are incentivized to create more demand for investment, so there's a strong pool of investors to exit to. And the investment community is incentivized to be a leader in this emerging sector so that they can capture the deal flow. And this process isn't just going on in the world of startups, it's mirrored in large corporates and in the institutional banks that serve them. A continuous conveyor belt of ideas that are pitched as being the next best thing and are going to change the world. So hype is clearly there, but it's also really important for getting the ideas off the ground. So without that hype, stimulating that investment, would any technology development even happen? Within our existing system, I think it probably wouldn't. But obviously that hype also comes with some costs. And I just want to touch on some of the consequences of the hype. Firstly, it becomes very difficult to discern what's true. And as we're going to see, the numbers often don't support the level of hype that we see. And I think the second point is that governments of all political leanings, they see this wall of money, they see this activity, they see this excitement, and they think, wow, how can we support this? Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But the problem is that there's no filter. There's no rule that says the ideas that are being funded are good. The only incentive for the ideas is that they're profitable, or there's a future expectation that they will be profitable. Some of the ideas might simply be bad for us, bad for citizens, bad for the transport system. But all those ideas are thrown into the mix alongside good ideas, possibly ones which are less innovative like buses or bicycles, as if they're equal, but with huge levels of excitement and expectation. So ideas are not equal, even within innovation. Let's just look at the numbers. So on the next slide, we can see the Gartner hype cycle. This is a great annual gauge of what's hot in technology. But let's look at how successful it's been. There are some interesting points. So when this analysis was undertaken, this is what they concluded. Out of more than 200 technologies ever listed, 25% of those only appear for a single year, never to reappear again. A further 20% became obsolete before ever reaching mainstream success. Some technologies never progressed, but actually returned through multiple cycles of hypes, things like quantum computing. This suggests that the timeline for a technology to work is also highly uncertain. And many technologies that have become mainstream weren't ever featured on the hype cycle. So hype can actually distract us from things that work, but are right under our noses. So in conclusion, technology is heavily hyped, but the cold hard numbers suggest that this can often be misplaced. So next slide, please. So what about decarbonisation? So what I wanted to do here was present one potential decarbonisation pathway. there's lots of different pathways, lots of different ways we could decarbonise. A senior academic once challenged me with a simple thought experiment, highlighting that one decarbonisation pathway would actually be to just turn everything else off. Obviously, we don't do that. We don't want to do that. We judge that it's much more beneficial to try to decarbonise within our current ways of life. We should be trying to limit changes that would create other hardships that we want to avoid. And the point he was trying to make is that actually decarbonisation pathways can actually just be seen as a series of value judgments. How much do we believe we should follow the science? What do we believe is morally right from our global perspective? How do we perceive the balance of costs? What's our vision for our decarbonised world? As someone who's pulled together a lot of these pathways, I kind of get that view. Pathways are a balance. They're a balance of these choices. It's natural to want to limit any changes to our freedom. And as a result, technology can feature very heavily in many pathways. The pathway is shown here. This is actually one we created for the Royal Town Planning Institute. This particular pathway tries to balance acceptable and achievable levels of demand reduction with modal shift that minimises the energy and embodied carbon for new infrastructure downstream. Within the project team, this pathway became known as the Do Everything pathway. I guess that name reflected the level of surprise many had that to make the numbers add up, you would actually need to do everything. Whereas pathways focus purely on technology offer the idea that there might be a silver bullet. But fundamentally, I think good pathways have to manage risk. They have to be deliverable. That view, I think, provides some fundamental foundations for how we should think about the role of technology. So I'm just going to make some final points on the final slide here. So the first one is that climate change cannot be treated like a normal project. It's highly uncertain on multiple dimensions, but most of all, it's particularly risky along the time dimension. We don't know how long we have. We don't know where the tipping points lie. And this means we have to act quickly, much faster than we've been acting in the past, most importantly in areas that don't themselves have embodied carbon. The second point is that not all technologies will succeed or succeed quickly enough. So the timings and the fundamentals of some of those technologies are highly uncertain. Technology is hard. It can take decades. And then even once it works, deploying it can also take decades. So consider something like a nuclear power station. A nuclear power station will take 25 years to commission and build. That means any nuclear power we need by 2050 globally basically needs to have been decided by 2025. And whilst I'm obviously picking a technology with a long lead-in time to deploy, just if you want other examples, look at things like the smart meter rollout or rural broadband to understand how long deployment takes. So to conclude, good decarbonisation pathways, I think, need to be cognizant of the timing issues on both sides. They need to understand the climate risks and the technology risks. There are real practical questions we need to ask about the pathways that are presented to us. They have to be deliverable. From a values perspective, I can understand the desire for pathways that enable us to leave our lives as we currently do as much as possible. But from a practical perspective, I really worry. If we've got the wrong technologies in our portfolio, at best, they're a distraction. But at worst, they could take huge amounts of resources and time and significantly delay us from taking the actions that we really need. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that, Laurence, and good to see that your phone worked in the end, so fantastic. I'm going to pass over finally to Laura Peacock. She's the Innovation Hub Manager at Oxfordshire County Council. So if you could turn your webcam on, Laura, and we'll pass over to you.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be part of this panel today. So I've worked as a manager of the Innovation Hub at Oxfordshire County Council for 7 to 8 years now, working in strategic planning and transport modelling and transport policy before that. I've developed a team that work on bringing innovation to the heart of local government, specifically Oxfordshire, but beyond. You won't be surprised that innovation, technology and challenging business models, in my view, is the way forward for decarbonisation, challenging ownership models, pricing models that Thomas covered earlier. For me, this is about getting a better deal for the public, giving innovators in academia, local government and businesses a chance to test and trial and implement. So you are not creating mistakes, about bringing the wrong technology on board. So if you can test and trial quickly and implement the successful technologies. So this is all about creating effective solutions to the challenges of climate change. So my pitch is less about technology and more about process, because that's the experience that I've had. The main points I'm going to cover today is about understanding and training in innovation, trust, multi-stakeholder engagement and the importance of that, and digital infrastructure across the board. So as I said, I don't think technology is the main challenge. I think the technology is there. And it's ready in many sectors. The innovation is there. Of course, as a local government, we need to know what's on the horizon, so we're ready for that. And as a transport authority, we need to know what the next new thing is. But there's already technology that's not implemented that we need to adopt. So the UK has already got a rich innovation system, and the government has shown a commitment to pushing that R&D forward, particularly in the last couple of years. But it's about building greater understanding and training in these emerging technologies, which I think Natalia touched in terms of EV adoption and creating that customer understanding. So some of the products that I've worked on developing are around transport modelling and next generation transport modelling. A lot of the fear of using it is not about knowing that it's a better product. It's about giving the time to train and understand the new innovations. So as the first innovation service for local government across the UK, we've been championed in smart sectors and brought positive stories and funding to the County Council, over 70 new projects, 60 million for Oxfordshire in terms of funding. However, when I start to talk about business as usual and moving those innovations into that day-to-day running of local governments and county councils, I get a very different response. So I think what's really important is talking about trust and trust in new innovations, so we can bring these new technologies that can help decarbonise local authority and government's fleet, and how we run the transport system, but also how customers understand that as well. I think we need to build a trust in technology, how we resolve issues of AI bias, ensuring data protection and digital ethics. To ensure the adoption of these technologies, we've got a huge amount of autonomous vehicle projects, and looking at that trust element and how we create robust, secure and public perception that's positive and understanding is hugely paramount. So as a county council, we are an unusual team. We're a service across the whole of the county council. We started with just 3 core members of staff. The success of the team and what we've created is around multi-stakeholder engagement, and I think that's absolutely crucial as we move forward on this decarbonisation of the transport system. There needs to be discussions between the finance professionals, the sustainability professionals, the legal professionals and the technology companies, because as you move through to implementation and beyond, all these sectors need to be on board. And I've seen that. I've seen a lot of the hold-ups with decarbonising our fleet have been within legal and procurement. So although it's not shiny and innovative, getting those things right is hugely important. So in terms of wrapping up, I will talk about one piece of infrastructure that I think is crucial for the existing innovation and technology and the new technology, and that's about more funding for the digital connectivity and the role it plays and the integral role it plays in enabling the UK to decarbonise and innovate at scale. And at scale is the really important thing, because we need to do things quickly. It's worth stating that not everything needs that digital connectivity, but it needs to be part of future solutions. So creating reliable, fast connectivity is absolutely fundamental. So for me, innovation, technology, we've got some amazing businesses, research in the UK, but understanding those processes and the critical infrastructure is how things need to be if we want to decarbonise quickly in transport in the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Laura, and certainly a valid point about digital connectivity, given the context of the decarbonisation plan. So if we can have all the panelists back on screen, please, with your cameras on, if you have them, if your microphones on, please. And we'll go to the first question from the audience, and that's from Sean Maroney, and he asks, does the panel agree that mass adoption of electric cars is not a sustainable solution due to the huge upstream and downstream carbon and resource footprints? And I'll go to Thomas, since you're centre of my screen first. Go ahead, Thomas.
Probably I've already answered that in my presentation. So yes, it's not the only solution. It has to be part of the solution, but if you work through the numbers, and you kind of saw that with Laurence's presentation on the fact you need to do everything, it doesn't get you where you need to be. So you therefore need to do more, and you need to use cars less. We need to change the way that the transport and mobility system works to give people better alternatives, so they can use lower carbon intensity forms of transport, because a very, very big vehicle, which a car is, containing a small number of people, is still going to be carbon inefficient compared to where we need to be to get to net zero. It's part of the answer, it's not the only answer.
I'll go to you next, Laurence. I think you're on the phone still.
Thanks, Elliot. So, I mean, I think the key thing I'd say is that we live on a planet with finite resources, and we're really at the limit of what the Earth can support. So I think that fundamentally we need to rebalance the way we think about all consumption in a way which takes those wider impacts into account. I think, Thomas alluded to it in his talk, where he talked about the fact that it's not right for us to think we can all have everything we want if we don't then think that others in the globe can also aspire to those sorts of lifestyles. So I think we've got to really think about how we ration what we take out of the Earth, and on that basis, I do think it's going to have to have a kind of key part to the solution, but it isn't. Consumption is something we need to address.
Great stuff. Anyone else want to come in there?
Yeah, I think I would just support what Thomas said in terms of those sustainable mass transit or alternative transit options that are not just single-use vehicles. I think that's really important. That's one of the ways that we're going to really change ownership models, provide viable options where people will choose to take an alternative form of transport. That is more challenging in the rural, semi-rural areas, and we're all trying to get our head around that with mobility as a service, demand responsive transport, which have been successful and not successful in some places. But some of the reasons for them not working so far is us understanding the pricing models and the business models behind that. So yes, I agree with Thomas there.
And I'll add a quick point, thank you, as well. The question I feel is a little bit loaded, and whilst I definitely acknowledge Thomas's point and others that we can't replace every internal combustion engine car with an electric car, there is a lot of academic studies and life cycle assessments which are pretty conclusive that electric cars are much better than internal combustion engine cars over their life cycle. And the grid, of course, there are environmental costs, significant environmental costs for making them and disposing of them. But the fueling is getting better every day. The grid is getting better every day, it's getting cleaner. And then there's additional technologies you can bolt on, vehicle to grid and grid sensitive charging. Those will also have an impact. So whilst I don't want to replace every car with an electric car, they are still much better, and we shouldn't be looking for a sort of a holy grail of a perfect solution.
Anything to add to that, Natalia?
I agree with all of you. No, like genuinely, like we do need to reduce the number of cars on the road, but electric is a really good solution for the cars that do need to be on the road. To Alistair's point, they're already so much better from cradle to grave than internal combustion engines. So yeah, I won't go on because you've all said it.
Great stuff. Okay, we'll move on to the next question from our audience, and this is kind of an agglomeration of a few. We've had quite a few people commenting that they believe there's a bit of a disproportionate focus on technological solutions like EVs compared to solutions primarily focused on modal shift. So things like expanding the rail, tram and bus networks. What are the panel's view on this balance? And we'll go to Laurence first since he's on the phone.
Well, I think in terms of the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, I definitely agree with that. I mean, I think it's a fantastic document in terms of its politics. I think it speaks to everyone. When I read it, I kind of termed it in my head the Jekyll and Hyde document because there's quite a lot of kind of double speak in there. But fundamentally, you know, this kind of this tension between the idea that you can carry on doing everything as we've always done versus the need to decarbonise is something that's going to play out over time. You know, I think fundamentally this is about, when we talked about the kind of the balance and the way of thinking about decarbonisation pathways, fundamentally this is about vision of what our world's going to be like post decarbonisation. And I just think that we should be planning our cities in a way that puts public transport at the centre, because I think that actually that's going to be much better for everyone over the longer term.
Go to Natalia next. She was last time, so go next this time.
What do I think on this one? I agree with Laurence. I think the world that we're going to live in 25 years' time is going to be very different to the world we live in today. I think we're already seeing a shift in, for example, car ownership. The need for wanting to own an asset that is mine and only mine for the next 10, 15 years until, I get a new one, or even less so. I think there's going to be a generational shift that's going to help this. It will be, I want to get from A to B in the most economical way. And actually, I think the transport system can enable that. Do I think the current system enables that for everyone? No, I don't. I don't think something like rail is particularly accessible for everyone to do kind of the journeys that they want. Rural areas are underserved. I think people are going to want access to cars, but it might just not be private cars, right? It might be more car sharing. It could be flexible ownership. Let's not talk about autonomous vehicles and the role that can play, because I think there's kind of still a lot. It's kind of up in the air, but I think autonomy will play a huge part of our new public transport system, which doesn't exist today. I think technological solutions need to be focused on in order to ensure that those types of transport are clean, but that in terms of the way we use and the way we travel does need to change, and that's more of a consumer mindset shift.
Anyone else have any comments to add to Natalia's there?
I'll just add one thing. So you go first, Laura.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add one thing. Behavioural change is so important at a local level as well. We've got this sort of strategic document from government, but it's implementing that at a local level, and they can get so emotive, these subjects. So if you're just looking at active travel, if you're looking at low traffic neighbourhoods, with the best will in the world, some of these haven't been potentially communicated in the right way to get the message across. So I think local policy and how we communicate behavioural change and how we decarbonise local policy is really important. And I think communication and evidence and not always just data, but just evidence to support those green policies is really important, but has been quite tricky. So sometimes they don't go ahead because there's too much opposition.
And I'll just add one thing to Laurence's point earlier about the decarbonisation plan and the fact that it speaks to everyone. There's a graphic in the decarbonisation plan, and it says, I quote, "The average coach saves between London and Edinburgh saves the equivalent of 15 cars worth of emissions." And that is absolutely true. But it's in the government's decarbonisation plan. So other than a statement of fact, why is it there? Because is there anything in the decarbonisation plan that's going to cause 15 households to shift from travelling from London to Edinburgh by car and onto coach? Because let's face it, we all know that none of us are likely to actually get the coach from London to Edinburgh. No one does. It's very, very small minority of people travel by coach. So statements like that are fascinating, but actually what's behind? Now, if the highways network was designed such that multi-occupancy vehicles got priority, that would make a difference. If the economic incentives were changed, such as the price differential between car and coach was significantly shifted, that would make a difference. But there's a danger that otherwise we just have facts like that, which are true, but ultimately without the behaviour change behind them, meaningless.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point, drilling down into the context of what's actually in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. Alistair, do you want to add anything to that?
No, thank you.
Okay, great stuff. We'll move on to the next question. And this is a question regarding the extent to which transport as an industry should be working with the energy sector. So this person asks, how much should the transport sector be working with energy to ensure that energy used by electric vehicles is truly sustainable or truly zero carbon? And again, I'll go to Natalia first on this one.
100% is my answer. And that's actually why I work in the business that I do. We can't talk about the transition to cleaner transport without talking about the energy production. I'll give you some experiences of what we're seeing as a business that kind of works in both of these sectors. We have actually very detailed engagement nowadays with the car manufacturers, not just about selling their cars from an Octopus EV perspective, but from a how do we make sure that the charging infrastructure you install or incentivize, or the energy that you want your customers to switch to, is not only good for their wallets, right, as your customer, but actually how do we make sure it's green, right? How do we make sure they're using that energy in a way that helps the grid, so we get into a world of kind of smart charging solutions and smarter tariffs, right? So there's already quite a lot of engagement from that piece, but actually we're also having a lot of conversations around bus depots and working with bus companies to talk about how do we create this high-powered infrastructure and co-locate it with renewables and battery storage. Like, we 100% need to be talking about these two things together, and actually these industries actually start to fold into one another, right? Because if you're a manufacturer of vehicles who are ultimately batteries on wheels, there's a big opportunity for you to play in the energy sector too. So there's a lot of these two sectors are coming together. They could work much more closely together. They need to in order to make this viable. You know, if we want a lot more electrification on our roads from different sectors, then we need to make sure we can generate the power, that we can distribute it effectively, that we can manage renewable energy on our grid down to the consumer level. So yeah, the answer is a lot.
Laurence, do you want to come in here on this point?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the key thing is to think about things holistically, and I think that ultimately, if you're coming up with a plan to decarbonise, that plan has to encompass everything that you're going to do to decarbonise. And I think that technology can risk creating silos. You know, so you have someone who's focused on hydrogen, someone who's focused on electric vehicles, someone else who's focused on the cantilevers or solutions for freight. And I think the key thing is to actually make sure that someone's thinking about this at a system level. And I think it was, another weakness of the Transport Decarbonisation Plan that the DfT pushed a lot of the energy questions outside of that strategy. So I think it is critical that when we're thinking about the design of a transport system, different elements of that transport system will use different technologies, different efficiencies, and they'll push up the use of energy or the need for electricity in different areas. So I think one thing that we could do, and I think is something we try to suggest to local authorities, that they think about what their own local budget should be, what their own local carbon budget should be, and try to foster sort of that holistic thinking so that they are at least planning as best they can to at least think about, how they can be net zero within their own jurisdiction, their own region.
So in that spirit of collaboration, Alistair, do you have anything to add to that point?
I think Natalia says it well in that these two things are now just inherently linked. In the past, they weren't really, but now that is just how it is working. And if we're looking at, for example, if we're looking at charging an electric truck at 1 megawatt, that is 3 or 4 times the power demand that the fastest or the most powerful car chargers that currently exist can deliver. So if we are planning demonstrations that would use that sort of technology, then the two are just inseparable. You can't possibly decouple them. So I think this is already, it needs to happen, but I think it's already happening. It's going very much in the right direction. So it's just one of those things. As technology matures, it will continue to happen, and we see how clever mobile phones are getting, and sort of algorithms and things like that, and it's just baked into the way that we live now.
Thanks for that. Thomas, Laura, anything to add to that?
Just to echo Alistair's point, I'd say about 8 years ago when I did my first wireless bus charging project, and also trying to get a hydrogen fuel station at one of our park and charges. One of the main barriers was grid, and how the grid could support that. And you know, since then there have been grid upgrades, but at the time those projects couldn't move ahead because of the energy system. So again, you know, whole system approach is needed.
Thanks very much for that one. I'm going to move on to the next question, and this is all about safety. So this person asks, how can we ensure that the suitability of new technology, particularly hydrogen, is safe, given the pace of decarbonisation that is required? I'm going to go to Alistair with this one first.
Sure, happy to take that. So safety is obviously really, really important. And I suppose my first thought on this is that we already do a lot of this stuff. So we already have tankers going up and down the motorway, which have a load of hydrogen in the back. Also the same with diesel and petrol that all gets transported around. And okay, that's a slightly different scale to what we're talking about. But this isn't really new in the way that we think that the way that it initially appears. And then my second thought on that is there is a huge amount of very detailed, dedicated design work, safety work, sort of sign-offs needed to do all these sorts of things. And whilst the pace is impressive, and it should be impressive, that does not mean that there are any shortcuts. Another example in the world of the freight decarbonisation that I'm involved in with the Department for Transport, we have a very close relationship with what was Highways England, now National Highways, and equivalent bodies in devolved administrations. And any on-road trial is going through exactly the same safety case and sign-off that any other sort of infrastructure change or anything else would go through. So it is happening, but this isn't as new as maybe it appears.
Anything to add to that, Laura, from your experience at Innovate?
Yeah, you know, again, there's a huge amount of research and evidence in the background that's already happened on this. Although it's not hydrogen, if you look in the safety cases for autonomous vehicles and the work we've done to ensure the trials are done safely, and you talk to all the multi-sector and multi-agency partners, the police, the ambulance, every time there was a trial on the roads in Oxfordshire. So yeah, again, the safety cases and work is happening, and there's no shortcuts, but the multi-agency partnership working is hugely important.
Anything to add to that, Thomas?
No, it's one of the great joys of living where we live in this country that we have an incredibly impressive safety infrastructure, and anyone who's ever worked in a safety critical environment as I have knows that we are very, very good at not taking shortcuts in this country. And the tabloid criticism of health and safety is one of the most bizarre things I've ever encountered. So I'm not worried that the people who are responsible for authorizing these technologies will make a mistake in that regard. I think there's many other dangers that we face at the moment in this whole program, but actually that's one I'm not particularly worried about.
Thank you. Laurence, have you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with everyone. I think all the innovation projects we're involved with, safety is absolutely paramount. I guess what I would say, and I think this is kind of something I did allude to in the talk, is just around the influence I think that venture capital can have in transport planning that might not be as clear cut. So I think that we obviously take safety absolutely seriously, but I think there are questions to be asked as to why we still want to put many of the trials of autonomous vehicles on road rather than on dedicated lanes. It's something we've been advocating for many years. I think it's also a question as to why would we need to scale up e-scooter trials so quickly before we've got the evidence around safety. So I do think that there is an influence role that the hype can have. So I mentioned this idea of bad ideas being mixed up with good. I think there is some danger there around safety, but overall, I think in the UK we are, in a very good position.
Super. And Natalia, anything to add to that mix, or if not, we'll move on to the next question. Okay. So the next question is actually from one of our former panelists in the last session, James Golden Graham, and he points out that the Climate Change Committee assertion is that we need to cut the total number of journeys by a minimum of 17%, yet the Department for Transport's projections within the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, amongst other sources, is for travel demand to increase by 50%. So can the panel see any role that technology could play in bridging this gap? I'm going to go to Laura first because I know she's talked about digital connectivity earlier.
Thank you. I think some of this is about looking at doing modelling these changes, and I think it's really interesting what's happened in the past couple of years, or the past year and a half, and how it's shown that we can make significant changes in the way we travel and the choices that we make. And I think to support that and to build on that moving forward, I think we need to de-risk it for businesses and show that they can support through modelling and evidence that we can bridge that gap. But I think modelling those journeys and understanding those behavioural changes is hugely important.
Going to go to you next, Thomas.
I mean, fundamentally, the answer is no. I don't think there's a role that technology can play in bridging that gap. It is an unbridgeable gap. We need journey numbers to fall, and the projections are they will rise. So we therefore need to prevent them rising if we're going to successfully decarbonise transport. And there's two things there. There's the first, overall, it's not a good idea if journeys increase beyond the level that we can sustain them, but above all, it's how those journeys are made, because a journey by, as the Transport Decarbonisation Plan said, a journey by coach emits a minute fraction of the carbon of a journey by car, and that will continue. The ratios will continue to be very similar once they're both electrified. So it's not about technology, it's about behaviour, and it's about the incentives that drive those behaviours. And at the moment, it doesn't feel to me that the decarbonisation plan will achieve net zero if we don't start to build in some of those incentives and behaviours. And it's interesting, one of the things you see a lot at the moment is the government, if you look at the buses strategy, for example, the government talks a lot about the success of the London model and rolling out the benefits that Boris Johnson saw personally when he was mayor of London. And London achieved huge growth in bus use during the noughties. But the bit that's missing is, of course, that was incentivized through road user charging in London. So you absolutely need the carrot. You've got to put in place the fantastic quality alternatives, and there's work being done there. But you do also need the incentive to stop using the higher emission modes.
Anything to add to that, Alistair?
Yeah, I like this question. I mentioned the Transport Vision 2050 before we came on, and we spent a lot of time when we were writing this document, a lot of time debating that topic. There's a section on transport and travel demand. Everyone wants it to go down. Likewise, we didn't really expect it to go down that much. We had quite a lot of concern about autonomous vehicles and would they result in dead miles. As you call your autonomous Uber to collect you from your house in 20 years' time, does it have to travel all that way empty? That would be terrible. We can't let that happen. So it's a really difficult one. It's a problem we need to solve, but I don't really know how we're doing it at the moment. Another thought is that we need to be a bit careful about how we look at those statistics. If we're thinking of if we're expecting to have a larger population in the future, are we normalizing the numbers against that, or are we not? Because we could be sort of seeing a rise and not really be a proportionate rise against the number of people, but it needs to come down anyway. So it's a really cloudy topic, I think.
Laurence, what's your views on James's question?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Thomas in terms of the incentives being absolutely key. If we look at the success in the power sector, it's through things like the fit tariff, contracts for difference, and actually, you know, the fact that those costs are being socialised through our bills or through charges to energy companies. So I think that getting the mix right in terms of what we're going to incentivise and what we're going to tax, those are key things that we basically need to agree within transport. And I think just an important point in terms of the costs of offsetting. So if you look at technologies like carbon capture and storage, you know, for those small handful of projects are actually kind of successful. I mean, you've got costs of offsetting carbon of around £700 per tonne, 700 to £1,000 per tonne. If you think about that for your average car, that would be an additional cost of over £3,000 per year if we were actually taxing the true cost of mitigating in that way. So I think that there is a big mismatch in sort of how we're accounting for things and how we're thinking about carbon pricing, but it is something that we're going to have to start addressing if we're going to truly make the changes that are going to be most sustainable.
Thank you. Natalia, do you have anything to add?
Not really. I echo what everyone else says, but I do agree with Laura. There's a big role around digitization, which I'm not sure is being looked at head on. You know, in order for this world to exist, it all really needs to be so connected, right? We really need to understand behaviours and demand, and what we have today isn't good enough. So I am with Laura that if we assume that technology could include that, then I think digitization of cities, systems, etc., is a big one.
Okay, I'm conscious, Natalia, that I've left you to the end of a lot of the questions recently. So the next one I'm going to put to you. First of all, and this one comes from Tony Davidson, and he asks, does the panel feel there is a role for other electric technological transport innovations like micromobilities, including e-scooters or electric bikes? So I'll go to you, Natalia, first.
So I'll caveat, I don't know a huge amount about this sector. I think from a consumer perspective, there's appetite. You know, it's particularly in cities, you know, getting from A to B, it's really easy, it's fast, it's convenient, it's cheap-ish. I think lots of other cities in Europe have had big uptakes of these sort of technologies. I think it also comes with its problems. I'd like to know more about kind of how these vehicles are manufactured, the sustainability of these vehicles, how long they last for, what we're doing with them after. Obviously, there's pieces around kind of safety on the road. But yeah, I think they will play a role because I think consumers will want it. But I don't know long term what the impact will be. I
know, Laurence, you mentioned micromobility in the answer to the last question. good to get your views on this one.
So I think the key thing is that we've got a competition for road space. So we can't put everything on the roads. And I think ultimately, because it's a competition, it means where you've got a bus lane, you may not be able to have a cycle lane. Where you've got cars, you may not be able to have anything. And so there is difficult choices. And I think the difficult choices are ones for transport planning to ensure that we've got the most sustainable modes being given the biggest hierarchy. That said, I think that there is a role for a different type of vehicle, and I think other panelists have talked about kind of how we're moving to bigger vehicles, larger vehicles, and I actually think electric mobility. So, for example, electric bikes, they could serve a much better range of purposes, if they were designed in a way that can enable us to do more of the things we currently do with our cars. There is an opportunity, I think, to move to smaller vehicles if we're kind of thinking in that way. But I think the challenge that we have is that we've got this competition for road space, which is fundamental, which means that things like e-mobility may just be a distraction.
Alistair, I'm interested to know the role of micromobility in the transport vision.
Sure. So again, it is a topic that comes up under the travel and transport demand. We talk about the sort of expected shift in the future. It's another one that was debated quite strongly in the authoring team. I think we had quite a spread of opinions, and I guess I see that myself. I live quite rurally, and I don't see any micromobility here. I see electric bikes every now and again, although possibly there are either cyclists who wouldn't have been cycling or cyclists who would have been cycling human powered without the aid of extra electricity. But I don't see any e-scooters or anything like that. And I think that's probably something that would continue. I feel like micro mobility is largely an urban phenomenon, and I don't have a problem with that. I just think that it kind of comes back to Laurence's point on the hype cycle. Let's not assume that it covers all 60 million people in the UK, because it probably doesn't have that reach. It's important. It's important in combination with other modes of transport, but it's possibly quite easy to overstate its importance as well.
I'll go to you, Thomas, for your view on this.
Yeah, so the question was, will it have a role? Well, the answer is it'll definitely have a role, because, and you can see that just through the levels of uptake already. I live in East London, where you'd expect there to be reasonably high levels of early adoption of this kind of technology. And yeah, I see e-scooters constantly and everywhere, and that's despite the fact they're currently illegal. So people are willing to break the law to adopt a new technology. That suggests there's an awful lot of latent demand for this technology. So the question then becomes, what will its role be? Will it be a positive or negative role? Because it's going to happen no matter what. And if you look at some of the early data that's come out of France, where they've had e-scooters a bit longer than we have, at the moment that suggests that roughly twice as many people are making journeys they would previously have made by public transport as opposed to made by car. Now, if that turns out to be the case, then the carbon decarbonisation impact of e-scooters will be negative, because they're going to pull people out of public transport. That makes public transport services less viable, makes public transport harder to resource, while also creating a new carbon footprint from those vehicles as well. On the other hand, if those journeys that are made by micromobility would previously be made by car, then you've got a huge reduction in the carbon impact of those journeys being made. And it comes back to the same old point. It comes back down to the incentives, because in a neutral environment, the France situation is probably what will occur. But that comes back down to the point that you need the incentives to use cars less where alternatives exist. And I think Laurence made a really good point. A key element to that is around the use of road space. Because if you've got a situation where it's very easy to drive somewhere and an e-scooter's squashed onto the pavement, then you're probably going to get people making more journeys by car. If, on the other hand, you move capacity away from road use, road space away from cars towards both public transport and e-scooters, then micromobility becomes a part of the decarbonisation solution. So it's all down to the incentives. But they will be a part of the future. I think there's no doubt about that.
Okay, and the final word of the panel goes to you, Laura. What's your views on the role of e-scooters and electric bikes in decarbonisation?
Echo what people say in terms of their role. The only thing I'd add is as these new mobility modes are coming onto the system, I think it's really important that they're integrated with the rest of the network and the rest of the public transport system, so we can support both public transport and these new modes as well, and also create incentives for using these as well, for using public transport, and then potentially using an e-scooter to then go into town and buy a coffee where you might not sort of ordinarily spend in the centre. So I think it's linking to tourism, it's linking to the rest of the network and the pricing structures as well.
Okay, thank you very much to the panelists and to you for dialing in. That brings an end to today's session. As I said at the start, our next webinar in the event will be on the 12th of October, where we'll focus on local solutions to the climate crisis. You can watch the session again today if you have a desire to do so on YouTube. But in the meantime, we'll see you later. Thank you very much.